The courtroom erupted in celebration. Laughter, handshakes, and even a few smug smirks filled the air as the not guilty verdict rang through the chamber. 3 corrupt police officers, Monroe, Reynolds, and Davis, clapped each other on the back, grinning like they had just won a championship. The defense attorney smirked, adjusting his tie. The judge gave a subtle nod, almost as if he had expected this outcome all along. Across the room, Olivia Carter sat perfectly still. Her navy blue suit remained unruffled, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But her eyes, they held something cold, calculating. Lieutenant Monroe, the leader of the officers, leaned over with a smirk. "Told you, lady. The system works for us, not you." Then Olivia stood, adjusted her blazer, and reached into her pocket. "Gentlemen," she said smoothly, "I think it's time I properly introduce myself." The courtroom fell dead silent. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more shocking stories. The courtroom fell silent as Olivia Carter slowly pulled something from her pocket. Her movements were calm, deliberate, in stark contrast to the chaotic scene moments earlier. The officers, Monroe, Reynolds, and Davis, froze in place, their smirks fading slightly. The judge, who had just ruled in their favor, shifted uncomfortably on his bench. The reporters lowered their pens. The public leaned forward. Something was about to happen. Something big. The courthouse was grand, imposing, its walls lined with polished wood and gold plaques. The air smelled of leather, old books, and the faint hint of arrogance. But beneath its regal exterior, the building was rotten. It was a place where justice was bent, twisted, and sold to the highest bidder. Monroe and his men knew this well. They had gotten away with countless crimes, planting evidence, brutalizing civilians, covering up misconduct. And each time, the system had protected them. Olivia Carter wasn't just another victim. She had been watching, waiting, calculating. Her navy blue suit was immaculate, her posture unwavering, her expression unreadable. She had spent years dismantling men like Monroe, brick by brick, lie by lie. But today was different, because today Monroe and his men thought they had won. Lieutenant Jack Monroe, the untouchable leader mid-50s, white, broad-shouldered, and confident. The kind of man who had built his career on intimidation, believes he's invincible, smirks as if life is one big joke, one he always wins. Sergeant Mike Reynolds, the enforcer, early 40s, white, sharp-jawed, with a quick temper, loves the power of his badge, uses his fists before his words, doesn't just follow orders, he enjoys them. Detective Aaron Davis, the nervous one, mid-30s, younger, jittery, uncomfortable, knows they've gone too far. But fear keeps him silent, wants out, but it's too late. Monroe scoffed, breaking the silence. "Lady, I don't know what you think you're doing, but court's over. Take your loss and go home." Olivia's lips curled into a slight smile. Not amused, not afraid, just waiting. Reynolds crossed his arms. "You deaf?" "We won." Davis wasn't smiling anymore. He was staring at Olivia, his fingers tapping nervously on the table, because something felt off. Something felt very, very wrong, and they were about to find out why. The air in the courtroom felt heavier now, a stark contrast to the arrogance and celebration just moments earlier. Olivia remained standing, her fingers gripping the small, worn leather badge case she'd just pulled from her pocket. Across from her, Monroe leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "This some kind of joke?" he scoffed, nudging Reynolds, who let out a low chuckle. But Davis wasn't laughing anymore. His fingers stopped tapping and a bead of sweat slipped down his temple. Something about Olivia's calmness unsettled him. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. She was waiting. And that was terrifying. The judge shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had seen defendants cry, beg, scream for justice. But this woman, she was in control, and he didn't like it. "Miss Carter," he said, clearing his throat, "do you have something to say before you leave?" Olivia tilted her head slightly. "Oh, Your Honor," she said smoothly, "I'm not leaving just yet." A flicker of confusion crossed the judge's face. Monroe rolled his eyes. "Lady, we don't have time for this. You lost." "Did I?" Olivia asked, arching a brow. Davis swallowed. "She's too calm." Something was wrong. Reynolds, growing impatient, leaned forward. "Look, sweetheart, I don't know what game you're playing, but we don't have all day." Olivia's lips curled into a slow, measured smile. She finally flipped open the badge case, revealing the unmistakable golden crest of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The entire room inhaled sharply. The defense attorney dropped his pen. A journalist fumbled for their phone. Davis's face turned pale. Reynolds' jaw went slack. And Monroe, for the first time, his smug expression wavered. Olivia let the silence stretch. Then she spoke, clearly, powerfully, without hesitation. "My name is Olivia Carter, director of the FBI Dead Silence." Then, panic. Monroe's chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet. No. This is bull. Sit down, Lieutenant." Olivia's voice was cold, firm, commanding. For the first time, Monroe hesitated. Reynolds' hands curled into fists. "This is a setup." Davis, he looked like he might throw up. Because he knew what this meant. Olivia reached into her other pocket and pulled out a thick folder. She tossed it onto the defense table. "Inside this folder is everything." She took a slow step forward. "Bribery, false arrests, beatings, cover-ups." Her gaze locked onto Monroe. "And your little arrangement with the judge." She smiled. "Documented." The judge's face turned red. A ripple of shock spread through the audience. People started murmuring, whispering. Journalists scrambled to write down every word. Olivia turned to the officers. "For years, you thought you could do anything and get away with it. That no one was watching." Her eyes hardened. "You were wrong." Davis's breathing quickened. I didn't," he stammered, looking at Monroe. Monroe's hands curled into fists. "This is a damn witch hunt," he roared. Olivia stayed calm. "No, Lieutenant." She gestured to the court officers standing by the doors. "This is justice." Monroe's chest rose and fell rapidly. Reynolds looked around, desperate, searching for a way out. Davis's hands started shaking. And Olivia? She stepped back, hands clasped behind her back, and gave a simple nod. The courtroom doors burst open. FBI agents flooded the room. Gasps, shouts. Monroe's eyes widened in horror. And Olivia, calm as ever, simply said, "Gentlemen, you're under arrest." The room erupted into chaos. The courtroom erupted into chaos. FBI agents stormed in, their dark suits standing in stark contrast to the confusion unraveling before them. The gasps of onlookers, the frantic shuffling of lawyers grabbing their papers, and the sharp clack of boots against the floor filled the room. Lieutenant Jack Monroe shot up from his chair, fists clenched. His face was bright red, his chest heaving. "This is a setup," he bellowed. "You have nothing on me." But Olivia didn't move. She stood still, composed, hands clasped behind her back. "Sit down, Monroe." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. And for the first time in his career, Monroe hesitated. Reynolds wasn't so composed. He shoved his chair back, knocking it over. "You have no right." "I have every right," Olivia interrupted smoothly. "And I've been building this case for 2 years. She nodded to an agent standing near the prosecution table. A thick folder was placed in front of the judge. "The FBI has enough evidence to put all of you away for life." The judge shifted uncomfortably. He reached for the folder with trembling hands, flipping it open, and his face turned pale. The evidence was undeniable. Falsified reports, bribes, fabricated charges against innocent civilians, unlawful arrests, undisclosed payments to the judge. A paper slipped from the folder, landing on the floor near Reynolds' feet. It was an official bank statement. A $250,000 transfer to Judge Harper's account from Monroe. A gasp rippled through the audience. Reporters scrambled for their phones. Reynolds was the first to break. He turned to Monroe, his face contorted in rage. "You told me we were safe. You swore they didn't have anything." Monroe ignored him. His brain was in overdrive, trying to find a way out. "This isn't real," he muttered. This is a bluff." He turned to the judge. "Deny this. Throw it out." But Judge Harper said nothing. His hands were shaking. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple. Because he knew. If Monroe went down, so would he. Davis, the youngest officer, hadn't moved. His skin looked gray. Finally, he spoke. "They know everything." Monroe whipped his head toward him. "Shut your mouth." But Davis kept talking. His voice was barely a whisper. "They have everything, Jack. We're done." Monroe wasn't done fighting. With a sudden, violent motion, he lunged. Straight at Olivia. Gasps. A blur of movement. Before Monroe could even reach her, 3 FBI agents tackled him to the ground. He let out an enraged roar as his arms were twisted behind his back, the cold bite of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. "This is a political hit job," he spat. "This is corruption. I'm the victim here." Olivia took a slow step forward. She knelt slightly, meeting his furious gaze. "The system worked for you," she said softly. "Until today." Monroe thrashed, but it was useless. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control, and he hated it. A hush fell over the courtroom. Everyone turned to the judge. He still hadn't spoken. His hands gripped the edge of his bench, his knuckles white. Olivia turned to face him. "Your Honor, as of this moment, you're under federal investigation." The room collectively inhaled. Judge Harper's jaw trembled. This is absurd," he whispered. "I've done nothing wrong." Olivia held up a second folder. This one had his name on it. She laid it gently on the table in front of him. "Go ahead," she said. "Open it." The judge didn't move. Olivia turned back to the officers. Monroe was breathing heavily, rage shaking through his body. Reynolds had gone quiet, accepting his fate. And Davis? He looked at Olivia with something close to relief. "You were never one of them, were you?" Olivia asked softly. Davis swallowed. "No." "Then why did you stay?" His voice broke. "Because I was afraid." A pause. Olivia studied him, then finally nodded. "Not anymore." As the officers were led away in handcuffs, the audience began to murmur. Then a single clap, followed by another, then another. And suddenly, the entire courtroom erupted in applause. Justice had finally arrived. Olivia Carter had won, and corruption had lost. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the courtroom. Monroe, Reynolds, and Davis were no longer officers. They were criminals. As the FBI agents tightened their grips on the disgraced officers, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, gasps, and the occasional suppressed laugh. The people who once feared these men were now watching their downfall unfold in real time. Olivia remained calm, her gaze steady as she observed them. The shift in power was undeniable. Monroe, still breathing heavily, glared at Olivia with a hatred that burned hotter than ever. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think you're saving the system? You're just part of the game." Olivia took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but lethal. "The difference between you and me, Lieutenant," she said, eyes locked onto his. "I don't play games. I end them." Monroe's jaw tightened. For the first time, he had nothing to say. A thick silence fell over the courtroom. All eyes turned to Judge Harper. The man who had just ruled in favor of Monroe and his men was now trembling. His hands gripped the wooden desk in front of him, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He licked his lips. His voice, which had once been filled with confidence and control, was now barely above a whisper. I didn't know." Olivia's head tilted slightly. "Didn't know what, Your Honor?" The judge swallowed hard. He knew that whatever he said next would determine his fate. His eyes darted to Monroe, then to the crowd, then back to Olivia. I didn't know how deep this went." A murmur spread through the crowd. Olivia let the moment stretch before she responded. "You knew enough to take their bribes." The judge's face turned ghostly white. Reporters snapped photos, some whispering into their microphones, documenting every word. Harper looked around desperately, searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. For years, he had bent the law to protect the powerful. Now, the law was bending back. Reynolds, who had been silent up until now, suddenly laughed. A bitter, humorless laugh. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "You really think locking us up will change anything?" He turned to Monroe, still grinning. "We're not the only ones, boss. There are more of us out there." Monroe nodded slightly, his smirk returning. "This system is built for people like us," he sneered. "You lock us up, 10 more take our place." For the first time, Olivia's expression changed. Not anger, not frustration. Something colder. She took a slow breath, then pulled out another file. She placed it on the table in front of them and tapped the cover. "That's what you don't understand, gentlemen." Monroe's smirk wavered. Olivia's gaze hardened. "This isn't just about you." One of the agents handed Olivia a tablet. She turned it around, facing the court. On the screen, a live feed of other arrests happening across the city. Police precincts raided, officers in handcuffs, politicians escorted out of buildings. The corruption wasn't just here, it was everywhere. And now, it was crumbling. The room erupted into gasps. Monroe and Reynolds watched in horror. They had assumed that even if they got caught, they could pull a few strings, call in some favors. But this? There was no coming back from this. Davis, the youngest and weakest of the officers, finally lost it. "I can help," he blurted out. "I can give names. Please, I don't belong in there with them." Reynolds turned to him, disgusted. "You spineless little—" Olivia lifted a hand, cutting him off. She studied Davis carefully. Then she nodded. "Take him," she said to one of the agents. "Put him in protective custody." Davis let out a shaky breath of relief as 2 agents led him away. Monroe's face twisted in rage. "You snitch! You're dead!" he shouted after Davis. "You hear me? Dead!" But Davis kept walking. He was finally free. With the criminals being escorted out, Olivia turned back to Judge Harper. "You have one choice, Your Honor," she said. Her voice measured. "You can step down quietly, or you can be dragged out like the rest of them." Harper looked like he might pass out. After a long, painful silence, he slowly removed his robe. He placed it on the bench. And then he walked away. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. The judge was gone. Reporters were already rushing to file their stories. Cameras flashed, capturing the faces of the fallen. Olivia turned to the audience. For the first time, she allowed herself a small smile. Because this wasn't just another case. It was a warning. To everyone who thought they could bend the law and never be caught. To every officer who had abused their power. To every judge who had sold their soul for a paycheck. Justice isn't about power, Olivia said more to herself than anyone else. It's about what you do when no one's watching. And today, everyone was watching. As Judge Harper stepped down from the bench, the weight of his disgrace settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. His once powerful presence had been reduced to a hunched figure silently walking toward the exit. No police escort, no farewell speech, just shame. And as he disappeared through the courtroom doors, a new reality settled in. This wasn't just one case. This was a reckoning. FBI agents escorted Monroe, Reynolds, and the remaining corrupt officers out in handcuffs. The once feared men, who had controlled the streets with intimidation and violence, were now the ones shuffling forward with their heads down, avoiding the flashing cameras. Journalists fought to get the best angle. Jack Monroe, do you have anything to say for yourself? Mike Reynolds, how long have you been taking bribes? How deep does this corruption go? But the officers kept their mouths shut. Their power was gone, and they knew it. Inside the courtroom, the energy shifted. People who had sat in the back rows, silent and afraid, now stood with a new sense of pride. For years, they had seen justice bent and broken. But today, justice fought back. A young black woman in the audience, clutching a notebook filled with years of denied cases, wiped her eyes. She had stopped believing that change was possible, but Olivia Carter just proved her wrong. Meanwhile, in a separate holding room, Detective Aaron Davis sat alone, his hands shaking as he sipped a cup of water. He was no longer wearing his badge. For the first time in years, he was just a man. No power, no protection. Just a man who had stood by while others destroyed lives. The door creaked open, and Olivia stepped inside. Davis immediately sat up, his eyes filled with nervous energy. I told you I'd help," he stammered. "I gave you names. Olivia held up a hand. "And we'll take that into account." Davis swallowed hard. "Am I going to prison?" A long pause. Then Olivia spoke. "You have a choice." Davis stilled. Olivia pulled out a single piece of paper. "Sign this," she said, "and tell the world what you did." Davis stared at the paper. His hands trembled. This wasn't just about avoiding prison. It was about owning his sins. Slowly, with a deep breath, he reached for the pen. And he signed. The ripple effect spread fast. Within hours, the headlines dominated every news station. FBI takes down corrupt police network in historic courtroom showdown. Judge Harper resigns amid bribery scandal. Lieutenant Monroe faces federal charges, possible life sentence. Across the city, people watched. Some cheered, some wept, some sat in stunned silence. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had fought back and won. Later that evening, Olivia Carter stood on the courthouse steps, facing a sea of reporters. The cameras flashed, microphones stretched toward her. But she wasn't here to take a victory lap. She was here to make a statement. She looked into the cameras, her expression strong but measured. "What happened today wasn't about me." The crowd went silent. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about politics. It was about something bigger. She let the words sink in. It was about trust. She glanced at the people gathered, at the young activists, the mothers of wrongfully convicted sons, the journalists who had fought to expose corruption. "Justice isn't a privilege," she continued. "It's a right. And for too long, too many people have been denied that right." A reporter raised his hand. "Director Carter, what happens next?" Olivia exhaled. "We don't stop." As Olivia walked away, her words lingered. She had torn down a corrupt system. But now Now she had to build something better, and she wasn't going to do it alone, because the people who had watched this unfold weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses, fighters, advocates, and that was the real victory. Justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed. As Olivia Carter descended the courthouse steps, the weight of the moment settled over her. She had won. But this wasn't just about one courtroom, one case, or even one city. It was about a system that had failed too many for too long. And today, that system took a hit it would never forget. Monroe, Reynolds, and the others thought they were untouchable. They had believed that power protected them. But true power, it comes from the truth, from those who refuse to be silenced, from people like Olivia, who fight even when the odds are stacked against them. Because justice isn't given freely. It's demanded. What do you think should happen to corrupt officers and judges? Should they face harsher punishments? Or is exposing them enough? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. If you believe in holding the powerful accountable, then make sure to like this video, share it with others. Subscribe for more powerful stories, because the fight for justice never ends. Thank you for watching. See you in the next gripping story.